let's get started. And thank you everyone for your patience. So this is, I guess we're kicking off day 3 of Asia 21 Young Leaders. I love saying that, Young Leaders Virtual Summit. And I guess this is an alum session. We are all in our different ways Asia 21 alum. And so it's really great to be back with this group. It's such a wonderful program, and I know we all want to thank the leaders of it, and particularly Sanjeev and also Tenzin, who made this possible. So thank you to you guys, and thank you to everyone. Hello. So we're talking about North Korea here, a perennial issue for all of us who deal with Asia in one respect or another. And we've got a really phenomenal group. I'm going to talk a little bit about them as a way to kind of launch our session, and then turn it over to them and get the discussion going. But let me just frame it really quickly with some thoughts. I think, so our big themes are peace and human rights. Okay, those are kind of the two concepts. And the discussion that we're trying to have today, in my mind anyway, is to bring together these sort of parallel conversations. There's an ongoing discussion and debate, both at a policy level, and we have people here who are focused on policy, and then also at, I don't know what to describe it, like a human level, about what to do on both of those sides of the North Korea sort of problem. The problem of the policy, getting the policy right, and particularly moving it away from the risk of war and toward peace, and then also getting the people right, getting humanity right, getting questions of justice and human security and human rights right. And so that's kind of, we should explain what we're talking about, and also why it's this particular group that frankly I thought, and we thought at Asia Society, would just make amazing contributors to that discussion. So we're going to try and weave together a kind of macro policy discussion with a micro human level discussion, and try to bring together, in the background are these two big goals that we all agree, like, who doesn't want peace on the Korean Peninsula? Raise your hand. And who doesn't want human rights improvements for North Korean people? Raise your hand. So we all want those things. How do we make some progress? And so to help us, to lead us, to provoke us, to inspire us, we've got these 3 phenomenal people. And let me just say a little bit about them. Usually you say you've read their bios, but we're not going to do it that way. I really want to encourage them to reflect on their experiences and their work and what they're currently doing, because that's, I think, where this conversation could be unique and can really contribute to all the endless North Korea discussions, and we can do something interesting. So in no particular order, Jieun Baek, she, I think, just received her doctorate. Congratulations. That's pretty amazing. A 2021, a pandemic PhD. I mean, it's no small feat no matter what. And to finish this year is incredible. At the University of Oxford, we'll be reading her book, from what I've learned, soon at some point. Also, that can be its own Asia Society event on dissent in Myanmar. So a new topic. She already has a great book out, North Korea's Hidden Revolution: How the Information Underground is Transforming a Closed Society. That was published by Yale in 2016, which is pretty messed up, because Jieun got her, she did her undergrad and her master's at Harvard. So I don't know how Yale University Press approved to publish that book, but they did. And she spent a lot of time at the Belfer Center, been associated with that. And so that's one of the overlaps in this group. She also worked for a couple years at Google and Google Ideas, and she was the North Korea expert in Google. And so you can see from that profile, she brings together serious academic chops with this interest in, again, the human level, human rights, and technology, and kind of where that comes together in the North Korea equation. And so I hope she'll talk about a new project I don't know much about, but I think we'll all be very curious to learn about. She set up a nonprofit organization called Lumen. And so we'll get back to Jieun. And then Sylvia is also Oxford educated. She did her LLM in international human rights law. She brings in a lot of the law part to our discussion. She co-founded an organization for North Korean human rights. And she was also, and I've always followed her work with fascination. She was a founding director of the U.S. She's from Canada originally. I think this was a U.S. organization, though. The first National Asian American Community Foundation in the United States. And so, she's already been at this intersection of racial justice and global human rights and justice, which a lot of Americans are reawakening to the urgency of that issue. And Sylvia's been there for a long time, and she's understood that nexus. And she'll have interesting things to say because she's also embarking on a new path. She's become a venture capitalist. I thought they were so scary, but she looks really nice. So she's going to talk to us also about technology and innovation. So there's a lot of overlap, but with her deep commitment to advancing causes like peace and human rights, and in particular human rights in North Korea, is something that she has thought a lot about. She has worked for a long time on. And our last but not least, my good friend John Park. I don't know where to start or end with this guy, but he did his MPhil and his PhD from Cambridge. So this is a real Oxford group here, not me, but these guys. And he's also a Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center runt. Can I describe you that way? He's now the head of an amazing initiative. He is spearheading their Korean security studies program. And it was getting liftoff and doing really interesting things, some of which I was honored to be involved in last year. And then this year, obviously, everything's been harder, and he's still making that the leading platform in the country for that topic, for Korean Peninsula security studies. His papers are seminal. Everyone reads and cites papers, working papers, literally, that still get cited, which is very rare in this arena. And he's just someone who gets it. He really gets it. He gets North Korea, but he also gets South Korea. And so he's someone who has incredible insight on the policy arena and this question of peace and security. And so that's my work is done. I've set these guys up, and now I want to turn it over for a round of, opening kind of comments and thoughts, and hear what you guys are up to and what you're thinking about with that framing of, peace and human rights. Who needs to do what to make progress, and what are you guys doing? And so let me start with you, John, if you can.
Sure. Thank you very much, JD. Really generous introductions, and great to be here with the panel. Good friends and colleagues working on these issues for a long period of time. And also my thanks to Mike Kolma and Tom Nagorski, all of the team members, Sanjeev and Tenzin, and you as well, JD, in terms of Asia 21. This has been a phenomenal network of individuals that has grown in terms of the ability to connect and have a greater impact as we go along. I'd like to start off with just a little bit about the Korea project at the Belfer Center. We're trying to look at the Korean Peninsula through the lens of what we view as a laboratory for global issues. If you think of all the major traditional, non-traditional security issues, they play out very quickly on the Korean Peninsula. And so we've been trying to expand Korean security studies field from that angle. So the idea is, if you can think about a functional issue, there is something that has taken place on the Korean Peninsula that provides insights. And so with that, what we're trying to do in the focus for our panel discussion here, the big focus in terms of the growth in the national security toolkit has been sanctions. And when you look at that, for a lot of the issues and challenges that the United States in particular faces, sanctions is the #1 tool. So if you think of it, analogies, sanctions as antibiotics, it's applied on everything now. And in the case of North Korea, the dosage has increased significantly. And that's tied with the overall effort to effect a peaceful resolution of the nuclear challenge and then move towards reconciliation, all of the things that were tried in the summits that we saw very recently. frankly, in previous administrations as well. So if I were to find the problem here in the increasing application of sanctions as it directly pertains to the topic of our discussion today, it's very much along the lines of something called de-risking. This is where in applying sanctions, even when humanitarian organizations, and particularly medical humanitarian organizations, despite going to the State Department, to the Treasury Department of the United States, getting very clear, explicit language and letters saying this organization is not violating sanctions at all, we support their activities. When they go and try to present it to private companies, financial institutions to do some of the transactions that are required to facilitate logistics, as well as funding and financing some of these humanitarian activities inside of North Korea, they're blocked. You can't force the private sector to do something that they don't want to do. They're very concerned about reputational risk or retroactive sanctions that come down later the line in response to subsequent North Korean testing of nuclear ballistic missiles. So the definition of the problem here, de-risking, directly affects peace, health, human rights in North Korea as narrowly focused, in this instance, from the perspective of humanitarian issues and the humanitarian work that is being done. So the thing I'd like to focus our discussion and hope get some more questions in the Q&A is a candidate solution. One of the things that we're working on with colleagues at different parts of Harvard Medical School, Harvard School of Public Health, and some of the individuals there, Dr. Key Park being one of the individuals who've been trying to make headway in this as well. We're trying to bring different resources together in different parts of our respective networks. And the candidate solution here is data analytics. Research groups in Washington, D.C., one in particular, the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, C4ADS, they've been applying advanced data analytics to map out where North Korean targets are evading sanctions. It's a very powerful technology. They've been very entrepreneurial in developing some of these techniques. So one of the early ideas, and it's at a very early stage that we're trying to work in advance further, is the notion of applying that kind of technology to map out a humanitarian banking system or a banking channel where all of the individual players have gone through this data analytics, so that anything that could potentially go up on the radar, cause concern, even in instances where there isn't a smoking gun per se in terms of sanctions evasion, but the concern that there is by association, something along those lines, and scaring off the private sector. This could be one way to also get some of the private sector players on board and reassure them through this type of transparency with data analytics. And final note here in terms of a proposed solution is looking at how we can network this so that it's a recurring channel. It's not a one-off. The reality of the situation is with the chronic challenges related to North Korea's nuclear program, we're going to contend with this problem for a long period of time. And because of that, sanctions will be that reality that continually exists. And so this is an area that we can carve out we see the nexus of these three areas in the specific focus here on the humanitarian part. Thanks. I'll turn it over to the other colleagues here.
Yeah, thank you, John. That is such a great way to get it started. We're all epidemiologists this year. I want the record. I want it in the record that when I first met John over 10 years ago, he was using medical analogies. So this is not a pandemic thing. Yeah, he's been drawing on that in a really deep way, in a sophisticated way, to get us to think differently about how we treat the North Korea sort of problem. And so he's still doing that. So that's really interesting. And the other thing I just quickly comment on that we can draw out more in our discussion is, John, you're kind of inverting the normal mode of interaction. I mean, the small group of humanitarian private citizens who engage with North Korea have tended kind of to an extreme opaqueness. I mean, everyone's so freaked out and paranoid for multiple reasons in track 2 endeavors in humanitarian. I mean, you're just constantly sort of afraid that something's going to screw it up, basically. It's not that anything illicit is going on. It's just, and so it's a great attempt to really turn that on its head and use transparency to actually allow for a lot more of the good kind of engagement that we need, so that's a really interesting approach. Well, I think that segues nicely to both of our next speakers. Jieun, do you want to hop in here and share your thoughts?
Sure. So I thought I would. I did some thinking about why we are kind of having this conversation at all. There does seem to be a false dichotomy set up between people who advocate for human rights in North Korea and then people who advocate for peace in North Korea. So I wanted to share a little bit about what I found, observations that I found to be a bit frustrating, and then talk a bit about what I'm doing and what my colleagues are doing in the information space. I think what I find a bit frustrating in this broader dialogue, not this one, but the broader dialogue about peace versus human rights in North Korea, is that there are false equivalencies that are drawn often between North Korea and the country of whoever is being critical of the regime's human rights situation. And so we hear, often I hear statements like, oh, well, there are human rights violations in every country, so why are we picking on North Korea? Or the popular whataboutisms. Well, what about issue XYZ in the United States or in South Korea or elsewhere? I think the undeniable fact, and I'm sure most of the panelists or the people who are listening in know this undeniable fact that the regime continues to systematically commit crimes against humanity, against its own population in 2020. There's a vast network of political prison camps across the country that we know of, foreign aid organizations, a lot of other humanitarian organizations are not allowed to freely and transparently distribute the goods that they themselves bring into the country. There are many reports and testimonies, memoirs, documentaries, satellite images, and other data that really make up the evidentiary backbone that clearly states that the human rights situation in North Korea is truly unparalleled in its humanity. And so what Professor Delury said earlier is that so what reasonable person would be against peace? And of course, the answer to that is no one. I think the reason why there is a heated debate between people who want to pursue peace on the peninsula is that there's a disagreement about what we mean by peace. And this is something that I think a lot of us look at. So there's different competing perceptions of peace, and I won't get too much into that. I think it'll just kind of suck up my airtime here. But one understanding of peace that I'm on board with, or some variation of this, is that if we can arrive at a place or a reality where North Korea can work to regain the trust of the international community to pursue peace by improving the human rights situation of its people, I think that's something that's substantive and sustainable version of peace. This scenario of the sustainable peace really integrates, I think, a long-term, meaningful version of peace in the peninsula and the region, as well as with improvements of the protection of rights of its citizens, of the North Korean citizens. And so one way in which some people work in the human rights to provide information to North Korean people. I have an American NGO called Lumen. It's a small group, so my camera's kind of messing up here. The small group, but we're one of many organizations based in South Korea, United States, Canada, Europe, and elsewhere that's working to create and curate content to make available to North Korean people, and then figure out ways to distribute that content to North Korean people. So, without talking too much about trying to focus on the I don't know if this volume issue is coming from my end or not.
Yeah, I'm having
some background noise.
Some background noise or something.
And so we're working on the distribution and the delivery side of things. And I think the solution in general, in terms of information access as a way that we can work to improve human rights as a means to achieve sustainable peace in the peninsula, one of the solutions is to integrate as many different people into coming up with ways to distribute information. And so, this formula is really simple. We collectively need the resources, funding, whether that comes from government grants or private individuals who have the resources to commit to these issues, ideas, and there are plenty of ideas that could really be backed to materialize and be operationalized. And then the talent, the technology, the engineers, the sound engineers, radio engineers, balloon engineers, and so forth. And then content creators. So there's different types of people in town that we can bring into this area of work. I think it's practical, it's sensible. There's a huge demand for information among North Korean people. It's obviously very sensitive, given the news coming out of South Korea over the past couple of days. But I think this is something that any civilian outside of North Korea can participate in and be part of the solution if you're interested. So I'll hand it back to the moderator.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, and there's more to talk about there. But I really like the way you framed it, Jieun. I mean, I think, well, I might supplement a little to say it's both a false dichotomy and a real dichotomy. Because you described, as you said, and I think it's part of the hard part of this conversation, is that on the one hand, yeah, who doesn't want peace and who doesn't want human rights? On the other hand, as you said, there's a heated debate for a good reason. Mm-hmm. There's not only tension, there's actually some conflict between these goals, depending on what you think is the best way to achieve peace and security and what you think is the best way to achieve human rights progress, right? And if as your work is pioneering, if one way or a key way or the way to improve human rights is through something that seems as simple as information, sharing more content and information, if in a way that's the most like systemic human rights abuse, but the government that you would need to negotiate peace and security with is even violently opposed to that, then you've got a tension there, and we can't pretend it's okay. We gotta think that through, and so it's both false and real, and I think you framed that very well. So we'll come back to a lot of the stuff you raised. Let's hear from Sylvia. Sylvia, what are your thoughts on this stuff and your own work and experience?
Yes, thank you. And I'm so excited actually to be a part of this panel, because I joke around that North Korean human rights advocacy was kind of like my first love, straight out of like college, when I was like a young idealistic law student. I've been kind of following the movement more from afar in recent years. But I feel like advancing that question that you asked, like who needs to do what? Honestly, that's a question that many, many PhDs have been trying to solve, for decades, if not years. And I see one of the questions, hi, Hee-chung. I agree, it's been a long time. This has just been one of those conundrum problems that no one has ever fully been able to fully solve. And it just felt, I think as an advocate, so frustrating at times to see the same thing being done over and over again by different administrations. Granted, the last administration did something a little different. So 2019 was a little bit unusual. But I would say that throughout the past 15 years that I've studied and been in this space, there just hasn't been much else. And so I think that's been part of the reason why there hasn't been progress. I'm excited to hear some of these new initiatives. And I will say that I have always argued for years that the North Korean nuclear threat was inextricably tied to the human rights, and that it goes hand in hand. They're almost like two different sides of the coin. But I think the real problem has been that there just hasn't been, for some reason, a new space, I guess, for like a new approach and a new strategy. The experts are set. A lot of them are not even Koreans, let alone, North Koreans themselves, although I know that's changing a lot now in DC. So I think for me, it just felt like it was almost like there just wasn't space for new creativity. So I left, right after I got my LLM, and, went on this wild journey of finding technology, innovation, what I like to call relevance, and the way money moves, which to me all led to the realm of impact. And, what is the impact you're really trying to make, the measurable impact? And it really showed me two things. So when you ask that question, for me, when we say who does what, first of all, I think we need to redefine and expand the who. I just think that the who's that's been doing it obviously it hasn't been working. And I love what Jieun said about bringing in, content creators and different types of perspectives. I think most importantly, reflecting on a lot of my work in human rights advocacy, I think that oftentimes the voice of North Koreans themselves are missing. And, they really need to be the ones at the front of this movement. They know the regime. This is their identity. This is their crisis. And I think sometimes when we think about experts and who's doing what, they're just not even part of that equation. The other thing in terms of expanding and redefining the WHO is bring in the innovators. I mean, John, I'm so excited to hear about this Korea Lab. I need to talk to you offline about that. I love Key. We need different perspectives. We need technologists. We need creatives. We need people who have solved even more complex problems to come into this space, because I think the WHOs that have been doing the WHOs, granted, I love, just the amount of intelligence and research that's gone into it. We just need to change things up. And then in terms of the what, for me, I've really focused a lot on disruption. I just love disrupting things. There's just so many things where you realize systemically things have just been going on with the colonial patriarchal mindset. And a lot of times we don't even question why things are the way they are. I saw this a lot in philanthropy. And one of the spaces that I found a lot of freedom from that kind of thinking was in innovation and technology. And that's kind of the space that I'm currently in. So I would love to also just disrupt the what and, really change our assumptions. Like when Jieun says redefine peace, I love that. Let's change the assumptions here. Who are the real experts? Is it really how many letters are behind your name, or people who have the lived experiences? Is it really, people who want criminal accountability, which is really actually more of my background, or is it people who are willing to compromise and understand that real outcomes and real impact are not always black and white? So I think there's just a lot of questioning that I've been going through. And I'll say that, right now, I just launched a brand new impact fund, and North Korean human rights is just, like I said, my first love. So I knew at one point I would be coming home, so to say. I think I'm still learning a lot because I'm very new to the venture capital world. But there's definitely a movement in the VC world and in impact investments to really focus on disruptive technologies, on human empowering technologies, how you use ethical principles to really allow for technology, not just to replace humans, but to really empower them. And I think that really is the key to what will empower North Koreans within the regime. And so those are just some of my thoughts, but I'm happy to share more as we discuss further.
That's fantastic, Sylvia. Thank you. I mean, I consider you like a songbae, to use the Korean. You're a wise elder because you were here, and I think the fact that I think flagging fatigue actually is really relevant and important because I think I haven't been doing this that long, and I've certainly already gone through a couple bouts of like, I'm so sick of the North Korea stuff, and part of that is, a lot of it is theoretical. A lot of it is an ongoing conversation because at the end of the day, we don't have a lot of access. It's a very hard place to go to. And you talk about empowering North Koreans, and actually draws my attention to the absence of any North Korean voices in our group, which is something to work on for next time. But, there's an objective problem. I shouldn't say but. There is also a problem of it's hard to meet with North Koreans. Yeah. And those voices are, back to Jieun's point, I mean, they're constricted within North Korea. Their borders right now are extremely sealed. In better times, they're still quite sealed. And they're cut off in terms of the ways that we communicate with one another. So those are really great points born of wisdom of having worked on this for a long time and taken.
I will say that at Asia Society, when I went in 2016, my cohort members might remember I was so depressed. Like I was like, oh my gosh, like I've been in this space and there's been no progress. And I actually that summit, as kudos to Asia 21, that summit really changed my perspective on innovation and problem solving. And, I've written a little bit about this, but there were so many innovators and entrepreneurs. And actually since then, I would say that's been the start of my journey into the intersection of human rights with technology. So, thanks to Asia Society and Asia 21.
So maybe we can swing this back to John, and actually one way to ask this at a kind of personal level, but that I think has this broader significance. I mean, you've been doing this a long time. How have you dealt with the fatigue issue. And maybe you can also, I don't know if you see our friend Heejung's observation and question in the chat, but maybe you can tackle that at the policy level, because actually it's very relevant. I mean, there's basically North Korea policy fatigue. The Obama policy of strategic patience was like, we're tired of this policy. Yeah. Like, that was born of fatigue. And we don't know, is Biden like going to bite? Is he up for it? You know? And so it's quite relevant. So maybe we could segue to that, and you could offer your thoughts and also any other new ideas or questions for Sylvia and Jieun.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And as we've heard from Sylvia and Jieun in terms of what they're looking at, their initial entry into working in this area, bottom line is the aspect of having this defined as a complex problem and having very creative thinkers drawn to the complexity. That's what we're benefiting from. If there's one thing about the Career Project, it's this idea of doing alliances, joint ventures, collaborations. It's an open platform. Our approach isn't that we have this reserve of wisdom and we're looking to spread it. It's more of, here are a collection of these complex problems. What do you see? What experiences from your functional background can you bring to this? And it results in a lot of fresh diagnosis. And that kind of energy has grown over time. So I first met Jieun when she was an undergraduate at Harvard College, when she was working these issues, trying to do more, connecting in her own way, very entrepreneurial and reaching out. And so, I think Jieun is a perfect case study in terms of going out, retooling, going to Oxford and looking at different aspects of a phenomenon now she can bring into her initiative with Lumen. And so encountering more and more individuals like that, it's contagious. And so we build and feed in terms of these types of angles and new perspectives that are brought to bear on these chronic challenges. Very quickly to Heejung's harder than matter question.
Yeah.
I worry that in many respects, we have a long list of individuals from the wide, now diverse political spectrum, in the sense of there's a lot of diversity within political parties. The consensus view of North Korea is understood as this type of problem. And so in many respects, how individuals dealt with the issue, even from a few years ago, the situation has changed so much on the ground in terms of relations on a bilateral, regional basis, things happening inside of North Korea. So I worry about this gap in terms of what we're offering and what we think North Korea wants by way of denuclearization and the package deal. So two quick things I wanted to raise there is related to this notion of North Korea today is fundamentally different from where they were in the security sense. After the testing they did in 2017, they have the capability, still in development, but the capability now, they've entered this realm of being able to send a nuclear warhead to the continental United States. And so in that respect, it's joined the ranks of China and Russia. So this type of problem and the urgency of it, it is something that is acknowledged by some of the analysts and those officials who want to tackle this problem. But there's also, I think, this underestimation that continues in terms of how the regime is able to adapt and essentially evade sanctions, the resiliency as well. And so if you're looking to apply policies from a different era to the challenge of North Korea today, you're going to encounter gaps. And the second point I wanted to mention is the China-North Korea relationship, and this is in your lane, JD, is a very complex one. There's a lot going on in the China-North Korea space, from commercial activities inside of North Korea, but more importantly, North Korean commercial actors embedded in the Chinese marketplace at the party-to-party level. And so for me, we have to first fully piece together what's happening there before we can entertain the thought of what the US and the Biden administration could offer by way of an opening type of engagement with the North Korean side. And so right now, that's our primary focus, trying to raise awareness about the changes that have taken place and try to put together some aspect of a game plan that would address the reality on the ground.
Okay, that's great, John. I want to try and kind of weave in comments and things from the group. So you've addressed some of Mike Colma had a follow-up. So later, why don't you give us your 20 seconds? He wants names, okay? He doesn't want the theoretical stuff. He's like, who's going to do what, So Mike wants names. Anyone who has names, let him know. I also saw our our dear friend Tom Gold is out there, someone who has deep understanding of China, and maybe he wants to add to the chat. Tom and I think maybe we didn't meet, but one of the first times we really hung out was on my first trip to North Korea. And actually something Tom said reminds me, Jieun, and I'll turn to you, but you talk about, it strikes me, you talk about information and how to get content and information. Well, human beings are content carriers. I'm sure they say that in Silicon Valley. And I mean, we can have a debate about tourism, and I have mixed views about tourism. But Tom and I, for example, were basically tourists. We're glorified academic tourists. We were generating some content there, and I remember, for example, one time where Tom said something along the lines of, to our North Korean minders who are still North Korean human beings, who live lives and talk to other North Koreans, and said, well, what happens to people who don't agree here? I mean, what happens to misfits? Like, where do you put them in the society, And he wasn't saying, like, show me your political prisons. He was asking it in a way that a sociologist could, in a kind of inviting way to think and engage and interact and plant seeds. So anyway, that just suddenly occurred to me because I saw Tom was out there. But Jieun, take it where you want to go in terms of thinking about what others are talking about, and again, the kind of who does what, like you talked about in terms of your organization in a very practical way. Maybe to Sylvia's question of expanding the who, that sounds like a great idea to me. Do you have ideas about that, how the who needs to be expanded?
Sure, but before I do, I'm curious, what was the answer to Tom's question of where do the
Tom, what was the answer? I only remember your question, so he can throw it in the chat. He already he had too long. He wants to ask if sanctions can be relaxed to encourage tourism. We'll answer that question if you answer Jieun's question about what did they say. We keep going, Jieun.
It's a good deal. In terms of who, this is something I think touches on in everyone's points here, especially in John's work. There are, I speak with a lot of North Korean escapees, just on a social level, personal level, work, and so forth. And for the audience, there's about 33,000 people from North Korea and South Korea. There's a couple hundred in the United States, Canada, Germany, Australia, so forth. And I meet a lot of people, especially folks who studied in North Korea, who graduated from Defense University, or Kim Il-sung University, people who were engineers in North Korea, teachers. So we're talking about professionals who then, have a new life in some other country. And something that I hear often is, I want to talk to someone. These are folks that are telling me, I know a lot of recent information about the tunnel digging in this particular area. I want to share this information with someone in the U.S. government or some allied country. Who do I talk to? And oftentimes I kind of find myself being some connector between various folks from North Korea and just people in my networks that I think may benefit from such information. So there's surprisingly a lot of people who have a supply of information that can, I think, benefit in various policies and solutions that we're talking about. So that's sort of one had. In terms of information we're sending into North Korea, there's a lot. I think we just need more people from North Korea in every step of the process of creating the content, curating the content. More of the folks who are the journalists, radio broadcasters who are trying to broadcast into North Korea, as well as the ones who are distributing the content. So there's so much room for to include folks from North Korea in policy discussions, information access, as well as ways to include them in policy formation in the United States.
That's great, Jieun. Let me add to that, and in the meantime, take a look. Mike Colma has a great question directly to you. So if you can, take a look in the chat, and then I'll turn it back to you if you want to answer that about trust. I'm thinking about this. Expand the who. I mean, these days I'm going nuts with the all male stuff. I've kind of had it. This is my official announcement. No more. No mas. Don't invite me. I just got through one yesterday, and I just can't take it. And it's not a Korean thing; it's global.
Global.
And it's got to end.
Across industries.
Yeah. Even Canada did one the other day, Sylvia. I was heartbroken. To Canada. So, but it's actually, as I think about it, and this is self-critique as well, because I didn't think to include North Koreans in our discussion, and there's various ways for that I need to think about. But one issue is gender. The North Koreans who are outside of North Korea, when I see the numbers, it's usually about 70% women. And it's and then sometimes you see this kind of socioeconomic, oh yeah, but they're just working class people, and the talkers, some of the most prominent voices who you do hear, gosh, they happen to be men, but there are plenty of women who are fully capable. They've literally published books, are fully capable, also fully capable in engaging in English, insofar as that's an issue, and yet we don't hear very much from them as much as we should. And I'm not casting stones here. I'm guilty of that as well. So I think that our gender bias really feeds into that in a very unproductive way.
Did you not just I was going to say, we should not only redefine the who, also redefine what we discuss. I mean, when I used to have these conversations with Key, John, just kind of those medical exchanges, there's been a real interest in North Korea in science, technology, innovation. I just think that, there's just opportunities to approach both peace and North Korea, and human rights by talking about kind of other peripheral topics that may not trigger the same reactions that lead to the same result. So that would just be another kind of way of kind of reconfiguring the problem as well.
Yeah, and taking it out of, sometimes it's better not to talk about North Korea, to talk about an issue, and then North Korea is one of them. It's in the set. And that's another way in which we can expand the what or break up the what. Not doing what we're doing today, but it's okay to sometimes have discussions. Jieun, did you have anything? Did you see Mike Coleman's question? And did you want to? He asks, Jieun, I believe you mentioned something about North Korea gaining the trust of the international community. My question is whether or not they really care about regaining that trust, and if not, what are the implications for making progress towards peace on the Korean Peninsula? And then, John, there's also one, you too, Jieun. But Tom Nagorsi has this on, the theatrics and failure of Trump's summits. So this is to all of us, do we support a Biden-Kim meeting with minimal preconditions, or what should the conditions be? So do you guys have thoughts on those? Jieun.
I'll just quickly go to Michael's point. Do I think that North cares about international community's perception? Probably not so much, insofar as, I think I think North Korea knows the whole world is aware of the human rights situation there. And do they care to really improve that substantively? Probably not. However, I think it deserves a little bit more of a nuanced response. At the very least, the regime has been using international language to try to at least signal that they are making some improvements, even if they are, hollow improvements, and they're essentially, not substantive. At the very least, because in the past they just dismissed accusations about human rights issues. Oh, political prison camps don't exist. There was no engagement with that dialogue. For those who are interested, Professor or Dr. Sandra Fahy is one of the folks who really delves into how North Korean regime has delved into the linguistics, the language, especially at the UN and other international institutions, trying to at least engage with the language. Of course, signaling doesn't equate substantive improvements, but there is some indication that they do care about what the international community thinks about their human rights situation. And I think there is some leverage that we can, there is some leverage I think that we can identify and press on moving forward. So there are, I think, small areas of opportunities to take advantage of.
Great, thanks. So, John, you want to weigh in on that? And again, Mike Coleman still wants names, issue of a summit. And also, there's a really interesting point from Tom Golden there about he made a follow-up trip and he noticed the vibe was more relaxed. And I made 4 trips total, and I could feel differences as well, just kind of the general tenor of things being really super stressed versus like a little bit more relaxed. And anecdotal, but Any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on the travel ban ending, that would maybe be a good thing, both in terms of peace and human rights? You're sending a signal like we're less hostile, and so you can kind of use that in a negotiation, because the North Koreans are always bringing that up, and it is pretty hostile to say like we won't travel to one another's countries. And you're also Jieun gets some content providers going into the country in terms of human beings, insofar as we think that can be a positive thing. So John, thoughts on that or other issues?
Sure, thank you. And on that point, when it comes to what's coming out of the Biden transition team, there is a willingness for leader-to-leader meetings, but frankly, there is that condition that they lay out, which is working level, progress at working level, meaning that if they do hammer out something along the lines of progress on a detailed roadmap of some kind, or even early stages of a roadmap on denuclearization, build on that momentum and lead up to the whole idea of leader-to-leader meetings. So it's an inverse of the process that we saw with the Trump administration. But within that type of formulation, I think it's crucial that they include human rights. That's the only time that you can really do it with any type of credibility. Trying to do it later in the process, it'll be pushed to the side. And so this is a critical moment, I think, thinking about what the human rights game plan is going to be as a part of a Biden foreign policy. That has to be the overall architecture, and then as it applies to important elements of human rights in North Korea, and then you get into the aspect of how you would develop the game plan for North Korea. It's a very difficult task, but it's one that, again, can only be done at the beginning of any type of policy or process. On the sanctions piece on tourism, as Tom mentioned, I wanted to quickly address that. There was an effort. The South Korean side, the South Korean government tried to get opening up of the Kumgansan tourism site and getting some tourism going on the inter-Korean aspect of it. But that was around the theatrics of Hanoi. And after Hanoi collapsed, that was pretty much the end of that. And it would have required a considerable amount of South Korea-U.S. coordination on that, because in many respects, you're looking at some of the U.S. sanctions that would have been potentially violated if you went that route. And also the multilateralization of some of those U.S. Sanctions at the UN Security Council. So there was a possibility, and we could revisit that, but it is intricate in terms of how they're all connected. And then finally, to Mike Kalma's questions about personality here, we're all waiting to see. The thing about President-elect Biden is that he's been in politics for so long. He knows so many people. He has individual relationships with so many that who he picks is going to be a big focus of how he looks at those relationships. But certainly within that group, there is a lot of muscle memory. When I mentioned my concern in terms of that gap, in terms of reality and ground and how things have changed, that's something that can be addressed, and hopefully we can get in some dialogue with that. But in terms of the cast of characters on that, there are a long list of candidates who could potentially play that role.
Yeah, Mike's not having it. He doesn't believe you. I don't either, but I'll cover for John by saying, Mike, you can read my piece in Foreign Policy. I answered the question for them. They don't need. I already recruited a general, which is not a very good day to pick a general, because everyone in my Twitter feed was mad about generals going to the Pentagon. I picked another general for peace in the Korean Peninsula. But so one thing, following from your points there, John, I'd be curious for others in the group, Jieun and Sylvia, like we're and there's a lot of questions kind of about the policy. And so how do we, I think one way to approach this is some of this stuff, like your initiatives, actually in both academic and nonprofit and for-profit VC, they need a certain amount of policy space. Some of them need room, and you need a certain amount of support, but a lot of it can happen without the policy. But I wonder, what do you think does need to be embedded in the policy? And for example, on the human rights side of the equation, and I've been asking folks who I respect in this field, like specifically to John's point, but how? Like, okay, on the who should do what should the Biden-Harris team do to embed these priorities within a policy, And one answer I've gotten is kind of simple, is, well, appoint a special envoy for North Korean human rights. Probably we'd all agree with that. But do you guys have more thinking about this from all your reflection? How do you embed it in the policy? Any thoughts on that? But you can take it in a different direction as well. There's so much on the table. Please feel free.
I like to disrupt it without the typical policy talk. I would love actually like an open task force, because actually one thing, John, that you mentioned earlier that I forgot to touch on was the public-private partnership that you're setting up with data analytics. I actually think that the public-private kind of partnership opportunity is something that's never really been fully applied to North Korea and might have some interesting outcomes or interesting impact. And that's something that I wonder about, just because I think that even for the North Korean regime, they know what's coming when you say summit, or like they know, like kind of like what Jieun said, they're already analyzing the press releases. They know it inside out, and I would love to kind of like turn them on their heel and just, you know, create some kind of disruptive North Korean task force that wouldn't just have, you know, the more kind of public policy folks, but more of the technologists, you know, but more of the people in Silicon Valley, perhaps, data analytics, cybersecurity folks, you know, some of the top minds that are out there, and to kind of have a more multifaceted approach. But that's just maybe more of my wish list than grounded in reality.
I don't know. That sounds very realistic and disruptive in a very smart way to me. Jieun, any thoughts on this?
Maybe if anyone on the transition team is listening, you know, open task force, open task.
We got our big idea.
On a smaller note, on a smaller scale, Lumen has been having these annual open calls for ideas, just open to anyone in the world to submit an idea online through a submission form, and it's ongoing now. Any idea you have to distribute information into North Korea. And, you know, we get tons of submissions. This is only our second year. And the ideas are so, and we ask people to submit ideas without consideration for resources or restrictions, just to, you know, think big, and we can always compare them now with barriers in reality. And so many of the ideas that we have kind of read, thought through, and considered, they pull in so many different fields. You know, some of these ideas, as wonderful as they are, we can't work with private entities to implement them because they need the support of, let's say, Homeland Security or the equivalent of that in, you know, various allied countries, or the State Department, or just huge government grants. You know, it would also require a sanctions waiver from the Treasury Department, OFAC and Treasury, and it also would need the engineer talent from Silicon Valley, or, you know, so on and so forth. And so, thank you, Tenzin.
Nice.
And so it pointed to, so that gives me hope that, not just hope, it opened my eyes to the reality that so many people from all over the world have very, very interesting ideas that are it cuts through various industries, inter-industrial ideas that I think can be some type of a prototype for some type of an open task force, whether it's in this administration or not.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, because to add 2 more wish list items, which have long been in my heart, but I'm slowly creating a funding base for it. One is to have some kind of a next-gen leadership conference for North Korean defectors worldwide. I know Hanvoi's organization I co-founded has started, but something that's more global in scale. And then secondly, to eventually run a hackathon. So I think that would go right hand in hand with what you're saying, Jieun, that kind of just open, let's just hackathon it out. And let's just get the best talent in one room, and then pair them up with the capital and just execute.
Actually, my friend.
Didn't that happen, Jieun? Are we making that up? Wasn't there something similar, or maybe a North Korean room?
Did I miss it?
You've been out of the game a little bit, you know.
Sylvia, I'm definitely calling you offline. Yes, there was Human Rights Foundation had a hackathon in 2014 in Silicon in San Francisco. And very interesting. They have a lot of footage online. I was present. A lot of cool ideas came about. And so there's something similar like that can happen with such low capital. And especially in COVID, this is the perfect time to make it open to anybody in the world, as long as there's secure platforms to do it on. And use the world as a talent pool to crowdsource some of the best ideas in this North Korea space, whether it is information and innovation or smart digital ways to try to improve the basic rights of people in, most closed societies, including North Korea, or with sanctions or, sanctions evasions and getting information in that field, which is going on as well. And so,
I love it. And I see Paresh has already said tech-enabled crowdsourcing policy innovation. I love it. I love it.
I think that should be the name of the task force. Again, along the lines of confusing the North Koreans. They'll be like, what?
They'll be like, what? Where that crazy comedian got in there and like changed all the language.
Everyone will say, well, you got to talk to the people at the TECPI. They're really running the show. Be one of these mysterious committees, So I was going to give a final round, but I think it's fitting that we don't have time for a final round, because this is like a glimpse of, I don't know if this is an ongoing conversation. For me, this is not an ongoing conversation. I think we're trying to bring together a couple conversations. So to me, anyway, you guys may be doing this. I'm catching up. It feels newer and really refreshing. I got to say, most North Korea conference conversations, I don't feel like I learn much when I leave. I feel like I did learn something today. I have new ideas in my head. So it certainly worked for me. I think we all really hope it worked for you silent faces out there who have been a part of this. We've tried to be active in the chat and bring in your questions. Didn't get to all of them. But hopefully we addressed a lot of them. And I think we all just want to, John, you haven't talked for a while. I'm pretty sure you got to be the oldest person here. Let's be Korean and give you the final word. Any last comment, anything you want to leave us with, a thought you want to leave us with in terms of this conversation?
I appreciate that. Thanks for the deference to seniority and old age and folks who are nearing retirement. Thanks, Kitty. I would just conclude by saying these type of ideas, this is what creates the spark. And so I think we have a lot of opportunities, even among members of the panel here, to continue and bouncing ideas off of each other. I would conclude with this point. The ability to work with students at a professional school, they're increasingly coming in from the venture capital world, from government, from military, every sector, every region you can imagine. And they're hungry to find a puzzle. And I think it's a function of connecting them. So a lot of the ideas that Sylvia and Jieun has mentioned, those are very easy type of ideas in the sense that they're complex challenges, but in terms of connecting them with these type of individuals who are, again, hungry for this type of challenge. And so I look forward to following up with my fellow panelists here. But thank you, JD and Asia Society, for making this possible.
Awesome. We'll leave that the last word. Thank you, everyone, so much for being involved. And thank you, Asia 21 and Tom, Sanjeev, the whole crew. And we'll keep the conversation going. So we'll leave it there. Goodbye, everyone.